I'm David Cott, host of the History of Spain podcast, and this is episode 5 called Second Iron Age, Iberians, Celts, and other pre-Roman peoples. In this episode you will learn about the native cultures that were coexisting in the Iberian Peninsula before the Roman conquest of Hispania. Subscribe to the podcast to not miss an episode. The first thing I would like to mention is that we must understand the ethnic, linguistic or other kind of differences I will mention here, not in a strict sense, but in broad terms. The pre-Roman cultures and peoples I will talk about today didn't have states as we think of them today. They didn't have strict borders. Instead, they were very fluid cultures that were, to a higher or lower degree, interconnected, and that sometimes intermixed. There were two major ethnic groups in the Iberian Peninsula before the Carthaginian and Roman invasions, the Iberians and the Celts. We also have the Celtiberians that were a mixed group, and the Proto-Basques, whose origins are still under investigation. The Iberians were pre-Indo-European peoples of the Neolithic stock that populated the Mediterranean side of the Iberian Peninsula, and their culture started around the 5th century BC. Iberian culture was a bit influenced by Phoenician and Greek cultures, as we can easily see in their artistic works. What we know as Iberians, though, is not a unified group of peoples, but different tribes of each area of the Spanish Mediterranean that share similar characteristics. For instance, in the Iberian territory there were multiple languages and writing systems. We know the sounds of the characters of the Iberian scriptures, but not their meaning since archaeologists haven't found an Iberian Rosetta Stone. Apart from the Greco-Iberian alphabet that used the Ionic variant of the Greek alphabet, the rest of scripts, the Northeastern Iberian, Southeastern Iberian, Tartessian and Celtiberian scripts, were semisyllabaries, which means that the writing systems were a mix of an alphabet and a syllabary. The difference is that alphabets represent phonemes, and syllabaries represent syllables to make up words. It was only between the 1st and 2nd century AD that the Iberian language disappeared, as well as the other Paleo-Hispanic languages, since they were all replaced by Latin. To learn about the Iberian peoples, we need to rely more on archaeology rather than literature, because all the literature about them is Greco-Roman and is biased. I mean, it's not like the Romans or Carthaginians made an anthropological study about them before their conquest. So yeah, this episode will not be narrative, just like the previous one. Anyway, let's get started. Iberians usually settle and build their towns on heights to easily defend the territory, and their towns could have walls too. This kind of urbanism is called oppidum and was found all over Europe. A very interesting fact is that cities that had an influence over the region controlled the area nearby by founding small towns or building dispersed houses. Cities even used sculptures that represented heroic acts to justify their expansion and influence. The architecture and urbanism were not as advanced as the earlier Tartessian urbanism, but compared to their neighbors, the Celts, they were more urbanized and less pastoralist. They didn't have advanced military technology like catapults until the Second Punic War, but Iberians were known as ferocious warriors that attracted the attention of foreign powers looking for mercenaries. Iberian warfare was endemic and made between tribes to raid and pillage. Iberians stood out for their ambushes and guerrilla tactics, and the infantry used hit-and-run tactics. Now, talking about their weapons, the falcata stands out as it's the characteristic pre-Roman sword of the Iberian tribes. The falcata has a single-edged blade that pitches forwards towards the point, the edge being concave near the hilt, but convex near the point, and they don't only surprise by their shape, but also by the quality of their iron. The famous Gladius Hispaniensis inspired the Roman military to adopt those swords after the Punic Wars in their Republican army. See an image of a falcata in your podcast player on thehistoryofspain.com or looking it up on Google. Iberian soldiers also used spears, javelins. They had both small and large shields, and Iberian horsemen were highly regarded. On another note, Iberian society was as stratified as any other urbanized society at the time, with its kings or chieftains, nobles, priests, artisans, peasants, and slaves. The nobles met in councils and chieftains maintained their power through a system of vassalage and servitude. The nobility was a warrior class, as it's evidenced by the sculptures and necropolis found that idealized aristocratic values. Iberian societies were extremely divided politically and led by caudillos, and only some united in confederacies to defend the territory from the Carthaginian and Roman invaders. Among their costumes, we find the Iberian debaucho, a pact of vassalage where the devotee, or client, swore to protect their caudillo or king, in exchange for protection and a higher social status. If the leader died, the devotee had to commit suicide, as they also vowed to protect their leader to the gods. This social institution played a major role in some heroic last stands seen during the Roman conquest of Hispania, and it served Roman interests later because Iberians quickly embraced the cult to the emperor. The Romans had a similar institution, but their debaucho was radically different, since in their case the Romans devoted to the gods to guarantee a military victory in exchange for their life, while Iberians offered their life to protect a person. Archaeologists haven't found any big sanctuary. Instead, religious rites seem to have been performed domestically and in the open. Iberians didn't like to represent their divinities like Greeks did. Therefore, we know very little about their religious beliefs. Nonetheless, both the Greeks and Phoenicians influenced their religious practices, as some of their deities were known and worshipped. On the other hand, they used ex-voto figurines that were unique, which means that they represented a different individual each time. Iberians offered the ex-voto figurines to the gods in open-air sanctuaries, usually for health issues, and animal ritual sacrifice was commonly performed as well. About their burial methods, Iberians always incinerated the bodies of the dead, using a funeral pyre structure. In their necropolis, we can observe how stratified their society was, with bigger tombs for the aristocratic families. Two good examples of their aristocratic burials are the Lady of Baza and the Lady of Elche. Both are beautiful sculptures that represented noble women, and they both had a hole in the back that contained the ashes of the woman the sculptures represented. Therefore, those sculptures function as funerary urns, and I encourage you to Google the precious works that are the Lady of Baza and the Lady of Elche, or to visit thehistoryofaSpain.com, the post of this episode, because I will post their images there, as well as in a MetaMark comparable podcast player. On the other hand, Iberians traded extensively with other Mediterranean people, as Iberian pottery and metalwork can be found in France, Italy, Greece, or North Africa. Horse breeding was important for the nobility, and the mining and metalwork activities were important in the Ebro Valley and in the region of Murcia. Grain-producing agriculture was the most important economic activity though, and it was the base that sustained a demographic growth from the 5th century BC onwards. They also had livestock of small animals like sheep, goats, and pigs, and again, Iberian pottery was demanded for its quality. Iberians imported luxury items, especially from the Greeks, like pottery, jewels, and perfumes. It's interesting to see how it's almost impossible to find Athenian coins, considering the amounts of Athenian pottery found in Iberia, something that indicates that trade with these items was done through intermediaries from the Greek colonies of southern Italy or France. From the 3rd century BC on, Iberians from areas near Greek or Punic colonies coined their own currency, which signals their increasing direct involvement in trade. Focusing on a particular group of Iberians, we have the Turdetani that succeeded the Tartessians. They were Iberians in the sense that they descended from the Neolithic settlers, but their language was quite different from those spoken by the Iberians. Instead, the Turdetani spoke a language closely related to the Tartessian language, and they live in the Guadalquivir Valley just as the Tartessians did. The Turdetani were the most urbanized and least warlike people of the Iberian Peninsula, as described by Greek geographer and historian Strabo. This is a quote from him about the Turdetani. Quote, The Turdetanians are ranked as the wisest of the Iberians, and they make use of an alphabet and possess records of their ancient history, poems, and laws written in verse that were 6,000 years old, as they assert. End quote. Every ancient geographer praised the wealth and fertility of the region of the Turdetani, even though they weren't as wealthy as the Tartessians used to be. The Turdetani exported wheat, wine, oil, salt, and of course they kept exporting silver, copper, gold, and iron, although, presumably, not in the same magnitude seen with Tartessus. The era of Carthaginian and then Roman presence further developed the Guadalquivir Valley. In relation to their political organization, they seem to have been politically divided in monarchical city-states before the Carthaginians and Romans arrived. Even though they weren't warlike, the political power was based on military power, as it happened in other Iberian societies. The Turdetani society was very unequal, with an aristocracy that lived a good life while most of the people live in a state of servitude, working in agricultural and mining activities. That explains why Carthaginians easily used native slaves when they conquered southern Spain. Moving on, we have the Celtic tribes of Indo-European origin that migrated to the center, north, and west of the Iberian Peninsula during the first half of the first millennium BC, and mixed with the natives that were already there. The development of those Celts was lower than that of the Iberians, primarily because they didn't interact directly with Phoenician or Greek colonizers. Some tribes were predominantly agriculturalists, growing almost exclusively wheat, but the majority were semi-pastoralists. Something that really demonstrates how their society was is that the property of the terrain was communal, but the livestock was private. They had social institutions like the hospitium or debaucho, with the hospitium being a pact between equals and the debaucho being a pact between unequals. The basic social organization were the gens, which means relationships based on kinship. The gens represented a larger and more important group for the Celts than the nuclear family. We see the manifestation of this social institution in their homes, where they had big family meals and every relative slept under the same roof. That changed with the Roman conquest though, and the belonging to a city or the parentage mattered more. The Celts were bellicose, therefore many served as mercenaries in foreign armies. Romans linked their belligerent society with their poverty, and they justified their conquest by saying that there was the need to pacify those barbarian and warlike peoples. We know that they share some gods with the rest of the Celts of Europe, like Loc, the god of war, Cernunnos, the god of fertility, or Epona, goddess of horses, that you may know because of Zelda. Celts had many local deities, and they either had druids or the aristocracy performed the religious rituals. To end with the general description of the Celts, I wanted to add that their urbanization was based on the castro culture, which means that they built walled oppida and hill forts known as castros. In the west, Lusitanians and Betones were the most notorious peoples. They live in the area that is Portugal today, in addition to Extremadura and the western provinces of Castile. It's not clear whether they were Celts with strong indigenous traits, or pre-Celts heavily influenced by Celtic cultures. The Betones had a differentiated culture, the culture of the Berracos, which consisted in erecting monuments and sculptures portraying animals like bulls or pigs. The meaning of their symbolism is unclear. It could have been religious, economic, or funerary. The Lusitanians live in more fertile lands than the Betones, therefore agriculture had a more important role, and the mining sector was relevant too. Trade, metalwork, and craft activities were marginal prior to the Roman conquest though, while fishing and hunting constituted important economic activities as well as horse breeding. The size of one's livestock showed the power and prestige of one person. Due to the social inequalities, some of the poor live as bandits, and bandolerism wasn't precisely a minor problem in Lusitania or Celta Iberia, especially during the instability of the Roman conquest. The northern Celts of the Iberian Peninsula were the poorest of all. They drank water or beer instead of wine, they slept on the ground, men grew long hair like women, they ate acorn and chestnuts for half a year, and they didn't use coins. That's understandable since they were very far from the focuses of developed and urbanized civilizations. Apart from gathering fruits, they relied mostly on ranching to feed themselves, and there are some good mines in the north, so northern tribes extracted some raw materials like gold, tin, or iron and sold them. The social organization and costumes of the northern Celts have been an object of study, because Latin texts said that Cantabria and Asturias had matriarchal societies. The fact that northern Celtic women farmed, inherited land, and had the power to arrange marriages for their brothers shocked the Romans. Now, let's talk about the mix of Iberians and Celts, the Celtiberians. When I say mix here, it's not a genetic mix in general, but a cultural mix. The Celtiberians were Celts, aka Indo-European, but with a culture influenced by that of the Iberians. They share the same social institutions and religion with the rest of the Celts, but their material culture was strongly influenced by that of the Iberians. Ancient sources diverge while delimiting the region of Celtiberia, but they live around the Sistema Ibérico or Iberian system that is located in the eastern part of the Meseta Central. The area apparently experienced a demographic and economic growth that also provoked a higher degree of urbanization and the emergence of walled towns in Celtiberia. Celtiberians were more pastoralists than agriculturalists, a particularity that has to do with the ecological conditions of their lands. I know that I have said the same about the others, but Celtiberians were especially famous for being ferocious and brave warriors, and archaeological findings suggest that as early as the 7th or 6th century BC, the area that corresponds to the Celtiberians developed a warrior and a stratified society. The Celtiberians play a major role in the native resistance against the Roman conquest, but we will see that in an upcoming episode. The last natives that need to be mentioned are the Proto-Basques. The ancient Basques were called Vascones, and they live a bit more eastwards than today, occupying the western Pyrenees as well as the eastern half of modern-day Basque country. Those people were related to the Aquitanians that live in southwestern France, but we know very few details about their culture, and even today the Basques are an object of study because their genetic and linguistic origins are a mystery. What archaeologists and ancient sources say is that their culture was influenced by the Celtic cultures, so consider all the points I mentioned about the Celts, and the majority of the characteristics will apply to the Vascones. The verdict! In today's verdict, I wanted to discuss the historic manipulation done by Basque nationalists in relation to who they are. To talk about this issue, I must first define what an ethnicity is. An ethnicity is a complex issue because it has much to do with how we perceive first ourselves as belonging to a certain group, and then how the others perceive us. The identity of an ethnicity is built around multiple factors, where each factor can be considered of different importance according to each ethnicity. As factors we have race, language, religion, material culture, ideology, among others. The thing with the Basques is that nationalism created an image of the Basques as an ancient, isolated, and distinct race, and two important problems that create nationalism are the national myth that has little to do with actual scientific history, and the fact that nationalism presents nations as fixed groups that don't change, which of course is false. People interact with each other, and no human ethnicity is isolated. Therefore, we cannot understand cultures or nations as fixed entities. Remember this, and this applies to all nationalisms. Cultures are dynamic, and that's how humanity has advanced. And with that, the verdict ends. As we have seen, the pre-Roman peoples of the Iberian Peninsula were quite heterogeneous. We have the Pre-Indo-European Iberians and Vascones, the Celts and the Greek and Phoenician colonies that heavily influenced the natives. It wasn't until the Roman conquest of Hispania that all those people were unified. To end this episode, let me remind you that the podcast has a website, thehistoryoфspain.com, where you can find the scripts of the episodes and a list of books about the history of Spain available on Amazon, and you can also subscribe to the weekly newsletter. Please subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube and more, review the podcast, and follow the social media accounts of Instagram, Twitter and Facebook. I hope you learned something and enjoyed today's episode. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.